Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
She said I was too toxic to be invited home, said it like a public service announcement after dessert when everyone was already stacking plates and pretending not to hear. And I sat there with my mouth closed because I learned a long time ago that raising my voice only feeds the story they like to tell about me, while lowering it gives me room to listen and remember, which I did, every word, every look. Every breath Mom let out like she was relieved someone finally said it so she wouldn't have. 2. I know how this sounds, and if you were here across the table with a cup of coffee cooling between your hands, I would tell you that I didn't argue because I've spent years paying for peace inside a family that treats peace like a free buffet, which meant I carried the bill for emergencies and birthdays and last-minute flights and even the insurance add-on that kept my sister on my plan, all while being told I am dramatic when I ask for basic respect, so when she called me toxic I just nodded, set my napkin down, and made a very quiet promise to myself that I would never spend another night subsidizing people who talk like I am a hazard sign. Emily, because of course her name is Emily, pushed her chair back like she had solved a problem no one else could solve, and Mom, whose name is Linda but who prefers to be called Mom as if the title erases accountability, stared at the table runner and murmured that maybe some distance would be healthy, which is what people say when they want your help without your presence, your money without your boundaries, your patience without your perspective, and you either learn to live with being mined like a resource or you stop the extraction and let them call you names. I drove home with my hands steady on the wheel and the radio off, not because I was calm, but because I was done performing a version of me that can be shamed into compliance, and I walked into my apartment and took out the folder where I keep the scaffolding of my life, the passwords and policies and contribution schedules that no one notices when they work, but everyone screams about when they stop, and I laid it all out on the kitchen counter like a map of a city I no longer plan to tour. There is a particular kind of silence that happens when you finally accept that love without respect is charity and charity without gratitude is a leash, and in that silence I opened my laptop, signed into my benefits portal, and saw my name paired with my sister's name on a line that once felt generous, but now looked like a boundary I had failed to defend, and my first thought was not anger, it was clarity, which is a much colder and more reliable feeling. Before I touched that line, I looked at the other places where my kindness had been turned into infrastructure. The automatic transfer that left my account on the first of each month for the college fund I set up when my niece was born because I believed in building ladders and because no one else knew how to file the paperwork. The shared streaming logins that were somehow always signed in at their houses and always mysteriously logged out at mine. The food delivery family plan I kept paying for because Mom liked to send Emily treats on hard days, which seemed sweet until you realize the treats always traveled one way. I am not a vengeful person, or at least I did not think I was, but there is a difference between revenge and restoration, and what I felt that night was the need to restore an order I should have defended years ago, so I opened the banking app, scrolled to the scheduled transfer, read the little note I had written to myself the day I set it up that said for her future because she deserves one, and I paused long enough to ask whether a future built on me being the family doormat was worth anything more than the mud on its welcome mat. Then I hit edit, set the transfer to 0, and watched the confirmation screen tell me in soft, friendly language that changes had been saved. The phone buzzed on the counter with a message from Mom about getting together for brunch to talk things through, as if brunch has ever solved anything more complicated than low blood sugar. And I let it sit while I moved to the accounts page for the delivery plan and the streaming services and changed the passwords to something long and unguessable, then used the little toggle that revokes every device except mine, which is not a grand gesture or a dramatic speech, but it is a door closing, and sometimes the smallest doors make the loudest echo when people have gotten used to walking through them without knocking. I thought about calling Emily to say that I heard her, that if I am too toxic to be invited then I am too toxic to be the paycheck behind the curtain, but I have learned that explanations are just invitations for a new argument. And I am finished offering stages for performances I did not audition for, so I changed my emergency contact at work from Mom to a colleague. Who has never once used the word family as a coupon code? And I sat there feeling the strange lightness that comes when you finally stop holding up the ceiling for people who keep drilling holes in it. When the next buzz came, it was Emily in a family group text asking everyone to pray for unity and maturity, which is her way of saying, please put this back the way it was without me having to apologize. And I stared at that sentence long enough to feel the old guilt rise and then fall, because guilt only thrives in the dark and there was nothing left unexamined. So I typed nothing, did nothing, and instead opened the benefits page again, navigated to the dependent list, hovered over the button. That would pull her off my plan, and waited, not because I doubted the choice, but because I wanted the moment to land. You can call what I did that night petty if you want, but to me it felt like finally matching the story to the budget, a simple accounting correction that would read as cruelty. Only to people who thought they were entitled to a lifetime subscription paid by someone they could insult and exclude. And before I shut the laptop, I removed my card from the pharmacy profile that kept covering their late-night pickups, canceled the address they used on my grocery rewards account, and set my inbox filter to send their group chat dramas to a folder I labeled weather because I wanted it out of sight and because nothing in that thread was ever about me, only about how I could be. Used to make the sky feel clearer over their house. By the time I went to bed, the apartment felt unfamiliar in the best possible way, like a place where I was no longer living on credit with people who mistake kindness for weakness and gratitude for defeat. And I lay there not sleeping, but counting the decisions I had taken back into my own hands, knowing that in the morning there would be noise and accusations and a chorus of how could you, but also knowing that I had made only one promise, worth keeping, which was that I would stop financing my own erasure. And if you are wondering whether I pressed the final button that night, I will tell you this and only this, because timing matters and I wanted the lesson to be unmistakable. I closed the laptop with her name still sitting in that dependent box. Then I set an alarm for the next business morning when the benefits office opens, and I smiled at the quiet, because tomorrow is when the first real domino falls. Morning came with the kind of administrative focus that people like my sister call cold, but that grown women with bills and boundaries recognize as the only language institutions understand. So I brewed coffee I barely tasted, opened the benefits portal when the clock ticked past the opening hour, and moved through the security prompts with the confidence of someone who has waited years to stop financing the disrespect dressed up as family tradition. Because if I am too toxic to sit at the table, then I am absolutely too toxic to keep paying for the plates. The dependent page loaded with her name tucked under mine like a footnote that had been allowed to hijack the story, and I took a breath that felt more like a decision than like oxygen. Then clicked the removal option that asked me if I was sure in soft language designed to keep women in doubt, and I read every line as if it were an oath, confirming that she was not my spouse, not my child, not my legal responsibility, which she had. Reminded me of last night when she declared independence from the inconvenience of me, so I accepted her declaration and returned the favor in the only arena she still understood. The one where coverage turns to air the moment entitlement meets a boundary. The system required an attestation and a date, and I picked the earliest date the plan allowed. Then added a short note for the plan administrator that explained in clean professional words that the dependent relationship had ended and all communications should be routed through me directly, not through any family member. Because I have been around long enough to know that people who call you toxic will try to fix it by sending tears to strangers and anger to your voicemail, and I wanted an audit trail that would hold when the shouting started. When the confirmation email dropped into my inbox with the subject line about a successful change in coverage, I forwarded it to my own personal archive, dropped a copy into a folder named Boundaries, and flagged it for retention, which sounds petty until you have lived through the kind of selective memory that turns your generosity into a hallucination, and then you learn that paper is the only memory that does not argue. I went to work and focused on my actual job, answered emails, reviewed a contract, laughed once at a joke a colleague made about how families will happily outsource their emergencies to the most competent person in the group. And I considered telling him that sometimes competence feels like a curse you only break by stopping the service entirely, but I kept that thought for later because my phone lit up with a call from Emily, and then 3 more, and then a string of messages that read like, Sirens, which I ignored because no one is entitled to instant access to a person they call a problem. Around lunch, a message from Mom came through, a long spill of panic about how Emily was at the doctor for something routine and the office said her insurance was inactive, and how could I do this, and did I understand what humiliation feels like? And I stared at those words while thinking about how many times I have swallowed humiliation to keep them safe and comfortable. Which is a funny word in this context, because nothing about being used is comfortable once you see it clearly, and I replied with one careful paragraph that said I would be happy to explain options directly to Emily if she wished, including COBRA and marketplace plans and employer enrollment windows, and that until I am welcome as family, I will behave as a separate adult with separate obligations. Minutes later, Emily's name flashed on my screen again, and I answered, because I am not cruel, and she started fast, said the receptionist had smirked and announced her coverage had been terminated, and did I want her to bleed out in a lobby somewhere? Which is how she talks when she is embarrassed, not injured, and I listened until she ran out of steam. Then I told her evenly that a dependent slot is not a birthright, that words have consequences when they are meant to exclude, and that if she needs immediate care she can pay out of pocket today and file retroactive claims once she enrolls, since the plan allows it, and that none of this required tears or theatrics, only grown-up action. She said I was punishing her, and I said I was honoring the line she drew between us, which she did not like, because it turns out boundaries feel very different when they block benefits you used to think were invisible. And she hung up on me with a sound I recognized from childhood, the sound of something thrown not at a wall but at a person who refused to flinch. And I let the silence settle while I opened my HR portal at work and updated my records to reflect that any calls from family members should be routed to email, because my mother has a way of calling receptionists and telling stories that make me sound like a villain until someone asks for documentation. By late afternoon, the group text had turned into a courtroom where I was tried in absentia by cousins who have never paid a bill on time and uncles who love the word loyalty more than they love actual accountability. And I did not enter the courtroom because I do not argue with juries who were appointed by the defendants, so instead I wrote a short, calm message to Mom explaining that I would not be available for phone calls for the next few days, and that if there were genuine medical concerns she could send them in writing, after which I archived the thread and stepped outside for air that felt less like a performance and more like ownership of my own life. When I got home, I opened the banking site and pulled up the page for scheduled transfers, not to press anything yet, but to sit with the knowledge that I have been pouring into an account whose custodianship assumes I am family. A word they like to swing like a hammer when they need help and like a trapdoor when they want me gone, and I let the cursor hover over the authorization like a metronome counting down to the next correction in a ledger that has been off for years. Then I closed the tab without acting, breathed, and returned to the benefits portal one more time to confirm that the removal had processed, which it had, clean and complete. And as I shut the laptop, I heard my phone vibrate with an email notification from Mom that began with the words, "We need to talk about the child," a subject line that told me exactly which domino would feel the next breeze. The email from my mother sat at the top of my inbox like a dare I had already accepted, full of dramatic concern about the child and about my supposed willingness to ruin a young girl's future because I was bitter, which would have stung years ago when I still believed that being useful would earn me a fair seat at the table, but today it only sharpened my focus on the one piece of infrastructure they never really understood. The college savings plan I opened the week my niece was born, because no one else knew how to compare state options or read the fine print, and because I was naive enough to think that putting money toward her future would bind us to something better than these fights. I logged into the plan portal with the same steady calm I used at the benefits site, and as the balances loaded I thought about the way my sister had thrown the word toxic around like a label you peel and slap on a storage bin. Useful only until you want the contents, but not the responsibility, and I remembered the day I filed the application and chose myself as the owner and my niece as the beneficiary, because that was the cleanest path to automatic contributions and tax advantages. And because I trusted my own discipline more than I trusted anyone else to keep the promise month after month, year after year. If you have never set one of these up, let me translate the power language for you, because it matters for what happens next. The person who owns the plan controls the money, chooses the investments, decides when withdrawals happen, and can change the beneficiary without asking permission from the people who enjoy the idea of generosity more than they enjoy the work of earning it, which means all those deposits from my paycheck did not transform into a communal pot. They stayed under the hand of the only adult in the room who read the rules before playing the game. I opened the activity tab and scrolled through years of contributions that began small and then grew in my promotions finally matched the hours I had been giving, and I paused at the notes I left for myself in those early months. Little reminders that said things like stay the course and tuition will not surprise her the way life surprised you. And I felt the old tenderness rise until it met the simple truth that affection without respect becomes a pipeline for exploitation, after which the tenderness hardened into something more practical and more honest. The plan site offered me 3 buttons, one to continue as is, one to change the beneficiary, and one to withdraw for non-qualified expenses with the familiar warning about taxes on earnings and a 10% penalty. And I sat with each option as if it were a moral argument rather than a financial tool. Then I chose the path that both honored the rules and clarified the relationship, which was to change the beneficiary to me and to schedule a future withdrawal for qualified education costs I had postponed for years because I was too busy carrying everyone else's emergencies to invest in my own next credential. I searched the list of eligible programs, found a graduate certificate in data strategy one had wanted since before the pandemic made everyone pretend they were lifelong learners, confirmed the institution's eligibility, and printed the page because there is a dignity in documentation that people who rewrite history cannot touch. Then I submitted the beneficiary change and set a distribution for tuition payable directly to the school, which the plan makes very easy when you are the one holding the pen, and I watched the confirmation number appear like a small, clean verdict. Before anyone starts composing a speech about innocent children, let me say what I wrote in the note field for the plan administrator, which was that the account had been funded exclusively by me, that the family had formally separated me from participation through exclusion, and that the owner was exercising a standard, lawful right to redirect funds toward the owner's qualified education, with no third-party consent required, which is the kind of sentence that sounds cold until you are the person who has been paying quietly while being called a problem loudly. Then, because transparency is my shield, I drafted a single paragraph to my sister and my mother, attached the redacted confirmation, and explained without apology that no further contributions would be made toward a child whose guardians considered me unfit for holidays yet perfectly fit for autopay, that the existing balance would be used for my own education, and that when they were ready to treat me as family, I would consider reinstating help in ways that did not confuse my wallet with their entitlement, which is less a threat than a return to basic arithmetic. The replies arrived fast and messy, a blend of moral outrage and budget panic, and the kind of threats people make when they learn that rights and privileges are not synonyms, including the old promise to tell everyone I stole from a child, to which I responded with a calm sentence stating that the owner of the plan cannot steal from themselves and that I would not engage further on this topic. After which I archived the thread and turned back to the portal to set contributions to 0 and to download the full statement history to a folder labeled receipts, because I have learned that memory backed by paper is the only language bullies stop pretending not to understand. By the time the sun slid behind the buildings I could not see because I was not looking for scenery, only for closure, my phone had filled with missed calls and a final email from my mother claiming she would come to my office and make me listen, which told me that the next move would not be about money but about access, about the old habit of showing up and forcing proximity until I gave in, and as I closed the laptop I felt the click inside me that says the next door to lock is not a bank portal but a boundary with a face, and if she walks into my lobby tomorrow, she will meet a very different version of the daughter she raised. By the time I woke the next morning I knew that the next correction would not be about accounts or balances or forms, because money had only ever been the symptom and the real disease was access dressed as love. So I made a list that would have looked petty to anyone who has never spent years explaining themselves to people who hear only what benefits them, and then I began closing doors that should never have been open without guardrails, starting with the family group thread that had lived rent-free in my pocket for too many years, which I muted, archived, and routed to a folder that my email filter labeled weather so that storms could rage without rattling my windows. After which I blocked my sister on everything except one email address, because documentation matters. And I set a single auto-reply that said she could reach me in writing for matters that required receipts, and that any emergency should be handled by the adults who live in her house. I moved through the morning like a quiet demolition crew, revoking streaming device authorizations that had somehow multiplied in living rooms I was not invited to sit in, unlinking the food delivery family plan that my mother used as a remote control gesture of love when the bill was mine, scrubbing my payment method from the shared pharmacy profile that had turned my card into their midnight safety net, deactivating the guest code on my apartment door that my sister still used when she wanted to drop off a child for free, babysitting, and replacing the physical spare key at the super's desk with a written note that said no one was to be admitted without my explicit same-day permission. A rule that made me feel both practical and a little sad until I remembered that sorrow is often what control feels like the first time you pick it up. At work, I sent a calm, professional message to HR and reception explaining that a family member might appear in the lobby and that while I was safe, I would prefer any interaction to be chaperoned by security and contained to the first floor, and then I added a simple line that said all calls about my personal affairs should be routed to email, because verbal narratives have a way of slipping into convenient fiction when delivered with tears. And I attached the barest context so they would understand I was not staging drama. I was preventing it from climbing our office stairs in heels and leaving mascara on somebody else's timesheets. Halfway through the morning, my phone flashed the building's number, and the guard asked if I was expecting a visitor named Linda, and I said I would come down and meet her with a colleague. Not because I needed backup, but because witnesses are the difference between the truth and the story told at Sunday dinner, so I took the elevator, stood just inside the security line, and watched my mother arrange her face into the expression that had gotten her everything short of accountability, after which she launched into a speech about family and duty and the unbearable cruelty of making a child suffer because of adult disagreements, and I let her finish without interruption because I am too old to debate openings when the title is a lie. When she ran out of rhythm, I answered in one long breath that I had listened to being called toxic and uninvited and unnecessary, that I had paid for stability without being granted belonging, that yesterday I exercised rights tied to responsibilities that I alone had carried, that love does not obligate anyone to fund households where they are not welcome, and that going forward any requests should be made in writing and limited to matters that bear my name on a contract, a policy, or a bill. After which I thanked her for coming, told her I would not be discussing my private finances in a corporate lobby, and nodded to the guard who had already started to understand that this was not a scene. It was a boundary being installed in public because private ones had never been honored. She pivoted to tears and accused me of forgetting where I came from, and I told her calmly that I had not forgotten anything, that my memory was the only reason I was still standing there instead of disappearing like they had asked me to when the word toxic fell onto the table like a final verdict, and that if she wanted to talk about the child's future, she should start by talking to the child's mother about respect, accountability, and the difference between needing help and demanding it as a birthright, after which I wished her a good day and rode the elevator back up with my colleague, who said nothing until we stepped out and then quietly observed that it takes a different kind of strength to hold a line without raising a voice. A sentence I saved like a small medal pinned inside my coat. In the afternoon, I sent a short certified letter to both my mother and my sister that summarized what had changed and what had always been true, that I would no longer provide access, coverage, or funds while being excluded from family life, that any contact at work would be considered harassment under company policy and treated accordingly, that emergencies were to be handled by the adults in their own households, and that if they wished to rebuild trust they could begin with an apology delivered without conditions, a request I did not expect to be met, but that I wanted on paper because even boundaries deserve a record of being offered with a path forward. When I got home, I stood in the doorway of a quiet apartment that finally sounded like mine, checked the locks, turned off message previews so my phone would stop jolting with every new attempt to pull me back into the circus, and opened the laptop just long enough to see a fresh email arrive from my mother with a subject line that began with my name and ended with the word please, a single word that can mean surrender or manipulation depending on what follows. And I stared at it without opening, breathing slowly, knowing that the next move would not be about doors or accounts or reception desks, but about the one place I had left open on purpose, the inbox where tears leave timestamps and where the story they tell themselves is about to meet the one I have been writing in silence. The email I had left unopened the night before multiplied into a stream by morning, each subject line a small performance that tried on different costumes to see which one would make me walk backward, starting with pleas about family and a child's future, moving into accusations about cruelty and betrayal, detouring through budget panic and sudden references to God and community, and then circling back to the same old chorus that I have heard since I learned to stand up straight, the one that says a daughter who pays quietly should also absorb blame loudly. So I made coffee, closed every app that tugged on my attention for sport, and began reading in batches. Not because I enjoy pain, but because clarity requires daylight and daylight requires that I stop letting their stories borrow my eyes. I learned something useful as I read, which is that apologies written by people who do not intend to change are just invoices for more access, and when I separated those from the honest paragraphs, few but real, that admitted I had been used and dismissed in equal measure, the structure of the day fell into place, because I do not need perfection to offer a path forward. I need truth and responsibility and a willingness to speak without the props of tears and threats, and until those show up together, everything else is theater that costs me more than admission. I drafted one message that would serve as the only statement I planned to make for a long while, and I wrote it as if I were explaining the terms of a project to a client, not to be cold, but to keep my footing. Starting with a plain acknowledgement that I had heard the words toxic and uninvited, and that I took them seriously enough to restructure my life around them. Then listing in clean sentences the actions taken and the rationale behind each one so that no one could pretend confusion. The removal from insurance, because coverage follows belonging in my world, and not the other way around. The redirection of the education plan, because the owner funds and decides, and I had chosen to invest in the one person in this mess who had not asked me to disappear. The closure of shared accounts and codes, because privacy is not cruelty when trust has been shattered. And the request that all future contact be limited to written communication routed to a single address I control, with a clear note that attempts to involve my workplace would trigger a response handled by company policy rather than family bargaining. Before I sent it, I attached a concise timeline, the confirmations from the plan administrators with identifying details redacted, the screenshots that showed dates and contributions and authorizations, the email I had sent to the office the day my mother walked into the lobby, and a short paragraph at the end that clarified, without any flourish, that my decisions were final for now and would be revisited only if real change appeared in sustained behavior, not in a weekend of soft words. After which I sent the message to my mother and my sister, blind copied my own council mailbox that exists not because I want litigation, but because documentation keeps everyone honest. And then I closed the laptop long enough to breathe and to listen to a silence that finally sounded like a decision instead of a threat. The replies came as expected, first the how could you, and then the you owe us, followed by the classic pivot to public opinion, a promise to tell the story in a way that would turn me into the villain again. And while that used to make my stomach drop because reputations in families operate on repetition rather than evidence, I answered with one sentence that rendered their campaign useless. A sentence that said any further attempts to misrepresent my actions would be met with the same evidence I had attached, shared calmly with anyone who needed to see it, and that I would not debate feelings while facts were ignored, and then I let the filters I had installed do their work by sending every repeat message to the archive where they could practice being static while I went back to living like my time was mine. There was one note I did not archive, A carefully written message to my niece that I scheduled through a third-party mail service to arrive when she is legally an adult and therefore able to choose her own conversations. A message that includes a short history without anger. A plain description of what I paid and why I stopped, the fact that I used the education funds I own to finish a credential that opens doors I earned without their help, and an offer that is not a check dangling from a hook, but a doorway she can walk through whenever she wants. Coffee with me on neutral ground where she can ask anything and receive answers supported by receipts, because my fight is not with a child. It is with the idea that love can be demanded while respect is withheld. When the flood slowed to a trickle and the workday steadied, I opened the portal for my new program and paid the first tuition invoice with the distribution I had scheduled, not triumphantly but cleanly. Then I set a note to myself that in 1 year I would review everything with the same clarity I used this week. And finally, I returned to the inbox to find one last message from my mother that said she could not believe I would do this to her, a line that made me understand the entire shape of our history, because the version of me she prefers is the one that keeps the peace. At my expense, and I am not available for that casting anymore. So when people ask what changed, I tell them nothing changed and everything changed, because they told me I was too toxic to be invited home, and I believed them, not as an insult but as a blueprint. And I built a life that does not depend on access I have to earn by shrinking, and now when my mother cries into my inbox like it is my fault, I let the message sit where it belongs while I lock the final door in a plan that was never about revenge for sport, but about justice with a steady hand, after which I close the computer, pick up my bag, and walk out into a day I did not have to buy by betraying myself.